Ladies and gentlemen, it's time for the 10th inning with Nick Mattos.
Oh, put me in cold. I'm ready to play today. Put me in cold. I'm ready to play today. Look at me. I can be center field.
Welcome to the 10th inning. I'm Nick Mattos, and joining me today in the Lethal Weapon 2 studio with my producer, David Perkins, is my good friend from the mighty 1090 down in San Diego, Danny Reiter. Danny does a sports talk show on College Gameday. That was during the past season here. And Danny knows a lot about the players that were drafted in the NFL. So I figured I'd reach out today, talk to Danny about the 2017 NFL Draft that just finished over the weekend. Hey, Danny, thanks for joining me today.
Yeah, of course, Nick, anytime. Love talking with you.
Well, I really enjoyed your College Game Day that you were part of the host on that, Danny. Each week you were on from 10 to 12:30 there, and I like to listen to it a lot. And I thought you guys did a good job of breaking down the college players, and we just completed the NFL Draft over the weekend. Round 1 was Thursday. Round 2 and 3 was Friday, and they finished up the draft on Saturday, the last 4 rounds there. And I just thought you would be a perfect person to talk about the Oakland Raiders and the San Francisco 49ers down here. The San Francisco 49ers had the second pick in the draft, and they did some interesting things there. John Lynch, the new general manager, and their new head coach, Kyle Shanahan, I thought they did a very good job, Dan, and we're going to talk about their draft. And the Oakland Raiders had number 24 in the first round, and I was a little disappointed with the Raiders drafted, to be honest with you, Dan. I thought they had an opportunity in their first pick to get a player that I believe was a steal. Reuben Foster ended up going to the 49ers in the 31st pick of the draft there, but you know, Danny, I want to start out by telling you something that I was hoping you would give me your thoughts on the commissioner for the NFL, Roger Goodell. You know, Roger Goodell is a guy that I think has done a fabulous job for the NFL, and a lot of times he gets overlooked. Since he's come in to be the commissioner for the NFL, he's done a couple of things, Dan, that I really like. I really like the new 2-point conversion. I think that was really important that somebody finally addressed that, because the point afters were getting so monotonous, and it was basically giving a team a point. And I like now the new overtime setup with each team gets a chance to touch the football unless the first team scores a touchdown. And, you know, over the weekend he was the ringmaster of the NFL Draft, and I thought he did a fabulous job of riling up the Philadelphia fans there. And, you know, for years, Dan, the draft used to be held in New York, and now that Roger Goodell's come in, he's let other cities hold it, and I think it was a fabulous idea. And over the weekend, we had the NFL playoffs going, the NBA playoffs going, and the NFL draft just completely trumped it, Dan. I think when I saw some ratings on it, most people, I think the NBA was down 20% when I saw the viewing. The viewers were watching, most of them were watching the NFL draft. I really think Roger Goodell's been overlooked a little bit about the effect and that he's had so far on the NFL. What are your thoughts on Roger Goodell, Dan?
I'll be honest, Nick, I'm going to completely disagree. And I'll admit I'm a little biased because I live in San Diego, which has had a very negative and bad taste in their mouth. I agree with you about the draft and the NBA playoffs. Even on a good year for the NBA playoffs, the draft tends to beat it. That's just football in general. I would say the NHL playoffs have been much more entertaining, yet that definitely gets beaten by the NFL draft. So that's one that they win. But I think the big issue I have with Roger Goodell is he's just such a shell of the owners. He's basically, I don't know if he has an original thought. A lot of these are just things the owners want. You look at a guy who's allowed 3 different teams to move in a 14-month period, yet says that, you know, keeping teams in their home markets is important to them. You know, why are there 2 teams in LA? Why would a team like the Chargers, who've been in San Diego for 50-plus years, now be out of there? I mean, you know, there's so many things that I thought were ridiculous. And I think the image of the league has not been good. I know that their ratings overall have been good, though they were down last year, but you look at all the issues with domestic violence that's been going on. I think their stand against marijuana is also getting a lot of flack. The NFL is still king, and it should remain that way, but I think under Goodell it's actually starting to take more of a hit.
Well, that's interesting, Dan. Your points are well taken, and I think there's some validity to each of your points, but I think because the NFL is just flourishing, I think you have to give credit to the commissioner. And I know, obviously, he's like the manager on a baseball team. If you're doing good, the manager gets all the praise. If they're doing bad, the manager's the one that takes the hit. And they're doing good. The NFL's doing good. They've doubled their TV rights. The NFL is the number one TV show on 5 networks. The game itself is what people like. I agree with you. But, sometimes you got to give credit where you might not think it's due. And I think Roger Goodell has done a good job. He's excited about his job. You see him out there a lot. His face is out there. He's not a guy that's hiding in the background. And, I can understand where teams have had to move, okay? Obviously, Dan, here in Oakland, we're going to lose our Raiders. They're going to go to Las Vegas here in 3 years, 2020. Your San Diego Chargers are now the LA Chargers. The St. Louis Rams are now the LA Rams. But I don't think that was the commissioner's fault, Dan. I believe that was those cities' fault, that they did not support those teams. And when you're not supporting a team and there's other places out there that really want a football team, an NFL team, Las Vegas certainly did want one. I was a little surprised that the Rams and the Chargers now are in Los Angeles after having no team there for several years. Now we have 2 there. So that might have been a little bit surprising. But I don't think you can blame the commissioner for that, Dan. And, your other points are well taken, Dan. I think, whenever there's a problem, you need to look deep, and it could be the commissioner. I don't know. But I just thought, Dan, over the weekend, the 2017 draft, the way that he was getting the guest speakers would come on, Dan, and it was entertaining. You could see how the guest speakers, and from what I understand, Dan, he told the guest speakers, you know what, go ahead and have some fun out there. Rib them. One of the people that I remember specifically was Drew Pearson of the Dodgers came out there, and there were several guys that came out there, and you could tell they were all the teams that were in the NFC East division there with Philadelphia, the New York Giants, Washington. It was just fun. I just thought it was fun. And from what I understand, Dan, Goodell told the guys, go ahead and have some fun. Let's keep everybody riled up. So that's kind of what I think about Roger Goodell, that maybe he's overlooked, that he's done a pretty good job. But your point's well taken, Dan. Did you want to disagree with any of those points or add something to those, Dan?
Yeah, a little bit. I don't think those teams moving didn't have anything to do with fans not showing up to the gate. It had more to do that those cities weren't going to use public money to pay for stadiums, and instead, with the Rams, with Stan Kroenke, he was willing to pay privately for his own stadium, and Vegas worked out their own public ones. So I don't think it's fair to say fans didn't support them, because I think especially Raider fans, there's no question they have one of the biggest and most loyal fan bases. They'll still be followed. You're right. The NFL has still stayed popular, but the question is, do you think that he has done a great job of making it better, or do you think it was just he hasn't screwed it up? Are we thanking him for not robbing a bank? I guess would be the analogy. And I think the NFL is on a precipice path. I think that there's been, a lot of people like it, but a lot of people who've been watching it for a long time who. And I'm not saying that you don't, Nick, but in general, there are people who maybe don't think outside the box about some of the things that they do. But I think the issue with CTE has become a bigger and bigger issue. And I think just the look of the league, I think they're making it all about points, but, now it seems like no one can play defense anymore. DBs can't really touch anyone. You consider a lot of those rule changes that some people think have hurt the core of football. You can't really nail anyone anytime it's a hard hit. There's always a flag, and I think the NFL is also getting closer and closer to oversaturation with these Thursday night games where, teams are never ready to play and you force everyone to do it. You have all these games overseas. And, I think the NFL, the new CBA as well, guys aren't practicing quite as much. You're seeing quarterback play and offensive line play maybe not quite as good as it used to be. I think there's just a lot of issues going on. And part of it also is Roger Goodell is seen to be not really a guy who makes the decisions. He's basically there to protect the owners. And I think also another thing I forgot to mention before, I think the whole Deflategate fiasco was a joke. There's just been a lot of things for me that is maybe not be a big fan of him. And I think Pete Rozelle was always the gold standard when it comes to sports commissioners, period. But I would put Goodell even well under Tagliabue.
Dan, this is perfect. Okay, the listeners don't want to come on and hear both of us say about the same thing and agree on everything. And this is precisely why I like to have Danny Reiter on my 10th inning. Okay, because you bring a different perspective all the time, Dan. And the things you're saying are well taken. I agree with them. But the game's changed. And Dan, it's funny because we talk a lot about how basketball's changed. I'm going to just use it as an analogy. The three-point shot has changed the game of basketball. Everybody now wants to shoot three-pointers. And football has changed too. It's a passing game now. The last time there was a running back that got the MVP in the Super Bowl, it's been many years. All the time the MVPs in the Super Bowls now, Dan, they're all quarterbacks or wide receivers, and a lot of people talk about Major League Baseball, how it has not changed over the years, and that there's a lot of need for change in Major League Baseball. So I really like the changes that have happened in football. The concussion syndrome's gone on a long time. That's why I'm a good friend with Jerry Robinson, and Jerry and I talk a lot about the concussion syndrome and the concussions that the NFL players have incurred over the years. And I really think the game has changed to help players. The contact is been cut down, Dan, and yes, it's changed. It's obviously they don't allow a lot of hits for defenseless players, and that's part of the morphosis of NFL football. And one thing I want to tell you, I do agree with you. I really don't like Thursday night football. I don't like it because it shortens the week for an NFL player. And again, I mentioned I'm pretty good friends with Jerry Robinson, and I know a couple of other ex-Raiders. And that short week, initially when they first started the Thursday night football, it was fun. They all thought, oh, cool, yeah, we're on national TV. But after it's gone on for years, I think the players understand that, boy, it's tough on my body. I just played a game Sunday. Now I got to play Thursday. Yeah, after the Thursday game, I get a little longer rest, but I could get injured on Thursday, and it doesn't matter how long I'm going to rest in. So I do agree with you that maybe the game is gone overboard with the Thursday night footballs. I think Sunday night football, Monday night football, that was great. One time a week, it's only a one-day difference. I like that. Traveling to the Mexico and to London, I think that's good for football, Dan. I really do. There's a lot of international countries that want to see NFL football, and yeah, you know what? It's once a year you got to go there, and it takes a home game away from a team. 2 years in a row now it's going to be the Oakland Raiders. Last year they went to Mexico. It was their home game, Dan, and this year they're again going to go to Mexico, and they're going to play the Patriots. I mean, what a great game that's going to be for the international country there to get to see the Oakland Raiders and the New England Patriots, two teams that I feel could end up in the AFC Championship game next year possibly, Dan. But I think both of us have brought up points that I think the listeners could either agree with or disagree with. And I'm glad I did bring this up with you, Dan, because I think you brought some points up that I'm certainly going to think a little deeper about. But my gut feeling is, and I really kind of like to go with my gut feeling, and is that Roger Goodell's done a good job. And I'm going to stick with that right now, although I may think about this a little bit further once we're off the podcast, Dan. But
I'll tell you this. I used to give him the benefit of the doubt, but I think the deeper you look inside the NFL, I think the more issues there are. That's kind of how it is. And like I said, I'm a little biased. I live in San Diego, and I really saw a lot of the dark side of the NFL. So I'm going to be a little biased and say someone who lives in, where I'm from, Chicago. It's a little different. But I think there are a lot of issues going on with the NFL that maybe weren't there or weren't as visible as they were. Like they weren't as visible now as they the past they may have been hidden, but now we're starting to see them.
Yeah. Well, the game is just growing in popularity. I mean, we mentioned earlier, Dan, and that the NBA, the fans have not really, if anything, when we had the March Madness going on, March Madness just blew away the NBA. Now, they hadn't started the playoffs for the NBA yet, and I'm sure the viewership's gone way up because the NBA playoffs are that's a whole second season, and it's pretty entertaining. I enjoy the NBA playoffs, and you and I may be able to discuss a little more about the NBA playoffs after we discuss this draft this year. And, you know, Dan, I'll tell you this, a couple of things that stood out for me in this year's NFL draft, and that was how many defensive backs were taken. I just was so amazed. In the first 27 picks of the draft this year, 8 of them were defensive backs. There were 11 defensive backs taken in the second round, 10 more taken in the third round. In the total of 7 rounds, there was 53 defensive backs taken. And I think that just tells us that most of the teams understand now that this is a passing league, and we have to be well armed to defend the pass. So, you know, in the old days, Dan, we used to say, you know, I'd like to grow up to be a cowboy. Well, I think now I'd like to grow up to be a defensive back, okay? If you're going to raise a young man, let's teach him to cover some people, because it looks like that's the way the game's going. Were you surprised about how many defensive backs were taken this year, Dan?
Maybe a little, but I think you have to consider with every draft class, it's different on, you know, how deep it is in certain positions. You know, this year it was deeper in DBs, but a lot of previous years it's deeper in the O-line. This year it wasn't quite as deep. I don't think we saw an offensive lineman get picked until Denver past the midway point of the first round. A lot of times you see those guys are top 10 picks, but this year it wasn't quite as deep. I mean, I think your point is very good about this is a passing game, and I think having DBs are becoming more and more important. But you always have to consider who's available. And, you know, as great as some of the defensive backs were, I mean, you look at the first 4 picks of the draft were not defensive backs. Excuse me, even more so than that. The first 5 picks were not defensive backs.
Well, yeah, Dan, then, okay, from 5 to 29 there, or 5 to 27, they picked 8 of them. So,
yeah, right. So it picks up after that.
yeah, and you know, Dan, you're precisely right about that. I thought this year the quarterbacks, I wasn't really high on any of the quarterbacks, and our San Francisco 49ers here had the second pick, Dan, and I had thought my feelings on picking a quarterback in the first round was that if you have a quarterback that you need and that you like, you should pick one in the first round. Since they had the CBA, you can get a quarterback now in the first round, and you can only have to pay him $12 million after, I think it's $12 million for 3 years, Dan. Is that correct, or is it $6 million? Am I wrong on that?
It's definitely cheaper than it used to be. I don't know the exact number, but, I mean, it used to be a lot more. But now, I mean, because of the way the CBA is made, rookies don't get quite as high a contract as they used to.
Yeah, and that's why my point is that since they've redone this, I mean, a few years back you could get a quarterback in the first round and it could cost you a lot of money. And I think the NFL is kind of taking care of that. The CBA's done a good job about that, because I think it's fair now. You don't want a rookie coming in and making millions of dollars where you have veterans are out there that are playing and they're not making nearly as much. So I really like that. And you know, the San Francisco 49ers had the second pick, and I thought maybe they'd go after a quarterback. But the craziest thing in the draft, Dan, was when the Chicago Bears traded up one spot. They traded with the 49ers. They went from number 3 to number 2 to get the second-round pick, and they took Mitchell Trubisky. But for giving up that one pick, they gave the 49ers a third-round pick, a fourth-round pick, and a third-round pick in the 2018 draft. So they really wanted their quarterback, Mitchell Trubisky. I know you're from Chicago, Dan. Did that surprise you?
Yeah, it shocked almost everyone because, frankly, none of these quarterbacks really stood out to anyone. I don't think anyone was really sold on any of them. I mean, personally, if I was going to take one of them, it would have been Deshaun Watson, but I wouldn't have taken him as high as the Bears were. It was actually a move that got a lot of flack, and a lot of Bears fans very displeased. And unfortunately, some booed Trubisky when he was at the Bulls game, which I thought was a little unfair because, why are you booing him? He didn't do anything. I think the issue is, and you talk about quarterbacks, but, when it came when it comes to quarterbacks, they're kind of an overvalued position in some ways when it comes to the draft. I mean, some of these quarterbacks are not that great, and yet you're gonna draft them higher than they should be. I mean, when it comes to the draft, you want to draft best available, and a lot of times the quarterbacks are not the best available. And for the Bears to give up so much on a team that's basically already rebuilding, that I actually thought had a good chance of getting someone like a Jamal Adams, a Jonathan Allen, a Solomon Thomas. To go and get a quarterback seemed a little perplexing. Also, when you just signed Mike Glennon to a couple of years and are spending a good amount of money on him. Not that he's definitely the future will be that great, but if you're already spending money, now you get another quarterback. And frankly, even John Lynch, the GM of the Niners, said he expected the Bears to take Solomon Thomas. So it was a surprise to him. I think he, on the other hand, did the perfect thing, and he's even admitted they were looking to trade away that pick because they wanted more picks. The Niners are in that position where they need to get good players, and they traded around, got more picks. And now you look at them, and now suddenly they have a much brighter future. Solomon Thomas, Foster as well from Alabama, who really slid down for them, which worked out well. They drafted plenty of other players in the later rounds, and they kept, using those picks to gain players. That's a team you're not going to turn it around in 1 year, and you don't need to put a first-round pick on a quarterback when instead you can get other good players. And as we've seen with Russell Wilson, as we've seen with Dak Prescott, you can get good quarterbacks later in the draft, and I'm not including people like Brady and Montana who were picked much later because those are, Hall of Famers. You can always find quarterbacks later in the draft. You don't need to draft them super high, and I think we saw it last year with Jared Goff and Carson Wentz, and even a bit this year. Teams maybe are overvaluing the quarterback too much when you can find plenty of talented quarterbacks around there. We've seen teams win the Super Bowl without great quarterbacks if the rest of your team is good. And I think San Francisco went about the right way, especially because next year there might be better quarterbacks in where it wouldn't be a bad idea to trade up if you have a team that's ready to go.
Well, Dan, I know this. You're spot on that because the 49ers are interested in the quarterback for next year. They didn't see anybody in the draft this year that they felt that was important enough for them to go out and get. They did take a quarterback, C.J. Beathard, a quarterback from Iowa. They took him in the third round. Just as you mentioned, Dan, you can get a quarterback down there. He's the grandson of GM Bobby Beathard. Pretty good player, I think, Dan. He started for 2 years for Iowa. What do you know about C.J. Beathard?
Yeah, I mean, a fine quarterback in college, not a star, but, a guy who's a perfect person to put a third-round pick on because – you're probably spending like $300,000 a year on him, which isn't doing much to your salary cap. You can try him out, and if he's not that great, it's not really killing you. And especially when you're in a position like the Niners are, you don't need to win right now. You can take your time and develop these other players and get them better and better so that in maybe 3 or 4 years you'll be there. The problem a lot of teams run into is they put, right now in the NFL, you're going to put your number one quarterback in right away, even if they really aren't prepared because you need to get them experience. But, when you're a team like the Niners, you can be patient.
Yeah, Dan, it's perfect. That was a perfect setup for me because I want to tell you about a similarity that happened this year with the 49ers. In 1979, Bill Walsh had his first draft as the head coach, and the Niners were coming off a 2-14 season, as they did last year. And they had no quarterback of the future, Dan. And this year they have a new coach, Kyle Shanahan, a new GM, John Lynch, and a 30-something owner, just as they had when Bill Walsh did in 1979. And everything is just it's so similar to 1979, Dan. And sure enough, the 49ers, I thought, looking at the complete draft, Dan, I thought the 49ers did a good job of getting a lot of players that were a good value with their draft picks. Now, when I looked deep into the draft, I thought Tampa Bay Buccaneers did the best job of getting the best value in the draft. Seemed they didn't have a whole lot of draft picks, Dan, but every draft picks that the Tampa Bay Buccaneers got were players that should have been taken much earlier in the draft. I just was surprised. They did a good job. They only had, 6 draft picks, Dan, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers had, and each and every one of the players was rated much higher than where they were taken finally. And so I thought the Tampa Bay Bucs did very well, but our 49ers here in San Francisco did a tremendous job. And you mentioned in the first round there, we thought Chicago was going to take Solomon Thomas. And once they took Trubisky, that opened the door for the 49ers to take Solomon Thomas, the defensive end from Stanford. And I think he's a fabulous player, Dan. I really like him a lot. There was some other defensive players that were of equal ability. I thought Jonathan Allen was really good. But more importantly, what happened for the 49ers with their number 31 pick, Dan, I think was the steal of the draft, if you ask me. Ruben.
Yeah, I'd agree. I mean, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. I mean, that's a
ahead.
top 10 talent.
Yeah.
That's a top 10 talent player there who had some off-the-field issues after the season. These are all post his post-national championship. And maybe he'll still have problems in the NFL, but with the Niners, you just drafted a top 10 talent later in the first round, so you're spending less money on him if he does flop, and if he is great, then you just landed a very talented player who really shouldn't have been there. And that was another smart move by John Lynch, trading up to get that pick there. And sometimes you get a little lucky with who's still there, but that's just smart moving, knowing we need to get better, period. Yeah. We need to add good players, and that's a good player that we think that we can make good, and that we're not too worried about his personal issues. And when it comes to the NFL draft, when you really look at it, sure, you want to hit in your first round pick, but it's a lot of the other guys, the late first rounders, second rounders, third rounders. Those are the ones that can make the difference.
Well, Dan, you're spot on Reuben Foster. I think before the Combine, he was going to be one of the top 5 picks, if not the first pick. Mm-hmm. He had such a fabulous year for Alabama, but at the Combine there, he had the watered-down P test, and he didn't play well with others. He had some problems there at the Combine, and, that was a big break for the San Francisco 49ers. And here again, Dan, we're Oakland Raider fans. We follow their show here, Overtime with Nick and Bob, comes on after the Raiders game here on Sunday. And I thought the Raiders had an opportunity to pick him at number 24, and they didn't take him. So I'm very happy that he's in the Bay Area, because obviously I would like to see the San Francisco 49ers do better. I've been a 49er fan for a long time and a Bay Area fan, basically. But you mentioned their first 2 picks, Dan, Solomon Thomas and Reuben Foster. They're going to start next year for the 49ers. And I believe their third pick is going to have a good opportunity to start also. He was the number 66 pick. Akilo Witherspoon. I love his size, Dan. 6'2", 6'2" and 3/4, 198 pounds. A cornerback out of Colorado, and he led the nation in pass breakups with 23. And at the combine, this guy was pretty amazing. 4.45 40-yard dash, and this guy, I don't know what his mom and dad were feeding him, Dan, but he's grown 7 inches. He grew 7 inches in 16 months. So this guy's just an absolute beast that's going to have a good chance to start for the 49ers. And then we mentioned C.J. Beathard. He was their 4th pick, the quarterback there that I believe will have a chance to be the 3rd quarterback. They went out and they did get Matt Barkley from USC and Hoyer, the quarterback there. Mm-hmm. I think he was on Texas last year. Dan, was Hoyer on Texas?
Hoyer was Bears last year. He was with the Texans a couple of years.
That's right, Dan. So pretty solid draft picks there. And I'm just going to mention one more here, Dan, because I don't like to get too deep, and I'd like to switch over to the Oakland Raiders here. But I believe another steal of the draft, and I believe you're aware of this young man. It's a running back, Joe Williams, out of Utah. He was selected in the 4th round by the 49ers, and I know Joe's had some real problems, some personal problems. But when you get to see him run the football, this guy's a pretty special player, Dan. He ran for over 300 yards against UCLA, I believe, last year. What can you tell us about Joe Williams?
Yeah, I mean, the times I watched Utah, that's always a competitive team. He had some real good games. I mean, they usually have a good run game. I mean, when you look at where they drafted him, I mean, with running backs in the NFL draft, it's hard to take them early, because you can get a lot of effective players later in the draft, and he could be one of those guys. He may not necessarily become a superstar, but he could be, a standard back for them for a few years, and that's, where you're drafting. If he can turn out to be that kind of player, that's good.
Yeah, well, if you can just get him squared away, he did want to quit football there for a while, and he's so fast. he's just one of those guys, Dan, that when you get these type of athletes, you know, we've seen these are very special athletes all through his life. He's probably been the best player on his team. I mean, you can imagine guys that make it to the NFL, Dan. They were great in Pop Warner. They went to high school. They were fabulous there. They get into college. They're tearing it up. These guys are a bit of prima donnas, Dan. You know what I mean? You got to be honest. And these special athletes, you know. So if once they get to the NFL and they say, hey, you know what? I'm not the only fish in the sea now. There's a lot of great players around me. I got to kind of straighten up a little bit. Otherwise, I'm not going to make it. And I think going to the NFL will be just the right medicine for Joe Williams. And I think he's going to give the 49ers some really good special teams play, punt returns, kickoff returns. They do have a great running back there that's been a good running back for them for many years. So I don't expect him to go in there and take over. But I think the Niners did really well. I'm going to say they had the most underrated draft because I think it was pretty solid. And like I mentioned, I like Tampa Bay's. I think they had the best value. I also thought the Cleveland Browns did a very good job, Dan. And, you know, Cleveland got their quarterback, Deshaun Kaiser, late in just as you mentioned, Dan, and I agree with you. If you don't see a quarterback in the first round that you want, you can get him in the fourth round. And sure enough, they were able to pick up Deshaun Kaiser there. I think it was in the fourth or fifth round. And again, they got Myles Garrett. I think Cleveland did a good job, and I'm hoping that Cleveland Browns become a legitimate team because, you know, you don't need a bunch of crappy teams in the NFL, Dan. It's bad for the league, and and Cleveland hopefully will be on its way up. Did you think they had a good draft, Dan?
Yeah, I think the thing that was common among both they and San Francisco, where they were two of the worst teams, but they went about the draft the right way. They focused on getting talented players in instead of worrying about getting a quarterback. You know, you can get quarterbacks or you can wait later. I mean, Kaiser, he's a guy who could be good, but you know what? You put whatever round, third, fourth round, whatever it was, it's a smart play instead of trying to, the rumors that they were going to draft Trubisky instead of Myles Garrett. Well, Myles Garrett's the best player in the draft. You don't need to sink to get a quarterback. I mean, we saw last year the defensive rookie of the year was Joey Bosa, who was the third overall pick because the first two teams picked quarterback.
Yeah. And, boy, Dan, I'll tell you that Joey Bosa really looks like he's going to be a great player for years to come, Dan. He really, he started out there. He didn't make the first couple of games. He was on a holdout. But once he got in there, Dan, he became pretty much a sack master, didn't he?
Yeah, well, we got to hope he can keep it up. We've seen a lot of sophomore slumps in the NFL. So now that they have a book on him, it'll be interesting to see how he adjusts.
Yeah, that's great, Dan. It's all about adjustments. Well, Dan, you know what? When we're looking at the draft, I mentioned to you, I thought those teams did well. But again, and people are going to hate this, but I got to tell you, the team that got the most production were the New England Patriots. Okay, they didn't get it. They didn't get it out of the draft, Dan. They didn't get it out of the draft.
No.
They went out there. They traded a draft pick for wide receiver Brandon Cooks. This guy could just tear it up in New England, Dan. I really like Brandon Cooks. He's so fast. They gave up a first-round pick for him, to acquire him for next year. But the players that they picked up, Danny, in free agency are players that are going to play a lot of games, okay? They got Coney Ely, Dwayne Allen, Mike Gillespie, Rex Burkhardt. These guys have been in the league. They've kind of been in the back row for these other teams, and now they're going to go to New England, and you watch, they'll flourish there under Coach Belichick and Tom Brady. And again, the Patriots will probably be back where they were this year in the Super Bowl. I just think the way the Patriots do things, Dan, it's other teams have to take a look at this, Dan. They have to use them as a template and see what are the Patriots doing. We need to do similar. What do you think about that?
Well, it is typical Patriots, but it's hard to be exactly like them because a lot of times you just don't see players the way they do. Bill Belichick has a certain eye for the kind of players they like. A perfect example, Reggie Wayne, who's, a likely Hall of Famer, I would say, from the Colts, great receiver for a long time in the NFL. When he was wrapping up his career, he tried going to New England and he couldn't make it. And he said they practiced harder than he expected. And sure, he was older than normal, but that's a very talented receiver who I'm sure could have made another NFL team, but he just wasn't ready for the type of way that they practice. Especially whenever I see people take wide receiver, not that there aren't wide receivers worth taking, wide receivers taken in the first round, but looking at New England, I mean, look at the wide receivers they had that they won the Super Bowl with. I mean, do any of them really stand out to you as amazing receivers, or guys who you really thought were big when they came out of college? Have you even heard about them coming out of college? I mean, if they didn't have Gronk, you probably wouldn't even recognize anyone that Tom Brady threw the ball to.
Yeah, that's a great point, Dan, and that's why it's so scary they're getting Brandon Cooks, because I don't know if they've had a receiver like him for several years. I mean, he can really stretch the field. It's going to be exciting to see what the Patriots do with him, and if he can stay healthy, he could be a real big factor for the Patriots there. And you know, it's funny, Dan, when you look at the other draft picks that the Patriots got, their first pick was not until the third round. Their first pick, and it was a defensive end from Youngstown State, okay, Derek Rivers. Also in the third round, they picked up Antonio Garcia, an offensive tackle from Troy. I mean, these are just not big colleges. You know, Troy, Youngstown State, these guys are really out there doing their homework, looking for those diamonds in the rough. You know, you got to love it, Dan.
Yeah, they like to get guys who have chips on their shoulder. I think that's probably what they look for again. They look for guys who want to prove people wrong, who are going to work hard. You know, Bill Belichick made that point in their Super Bowl parade, you know, no days off. Those are the kinds of guys that they want. And that's why they're not necessarily superstar guys, but they're guys who want to win.
Yeah, Dan, you know what? I got to tell you, every time I hear Bill Belichick speak, I listen, okay? I really like to hear what he says.
Well, you can hear him sometimes.
Yeah, well,
you know?
he doesn't talk that much, okay? So when he talks, I really put my listening ears on, because I just think the guy's one step ahead of everybody, and I don't think people realize when he leaves what a fantastic coach he was. I mean, he could be the greatest NFL coach ever by the time he hangs him up. And, you know, I'm looking forward to next season, because the Oakland Raiders, they went out and they got some good free agent players. They didn't address their defense in free agency. They went out and added tight end Jared Cook. They got a wide receiver, Cordell Patterson. They got an offensive tackle, Marshall Newhouse. And then, Dan, they signed Marshawn Lynch. And to tell you the truth, Dan, I was not very happy with the signing of Marshawn Lynch. I was very weary about it, and I'm hoping I'm wrong. But I've been I can tell you this, Dan. I've had a knee operation here recently, had a knee replacement, so I've been off work for 7 weeks. I'm getting ready to go back next week. And when you're retired, Dan, it's hard. I'm not looking forward to going back to work next week. I got to be honest with you. And Marshawn Lynch retired from the NFL, Dan, and now he's going to go back to the NFL after taking a year off. He's going to join the Oakland Raiders, who have to travel the furthest miles of any team next year. They're going to log the most miles in the air. They only have 7 home games, 9 away games, and they have a very tough schedule. I really don't know if Marshawn Lynch signed up because he wants to play NFL football, or if $12 million looked pretty good for the rest of his life. What's your thoughts on Marshawn Lynch? Because I'll tell you this, we had some mixed emotions on it on our show. Bob and I kind of agreed, and Jerry Robinson came on the show, an ex-LA Raider. He thought, you know what, Nick, they would not sign Marshawn Lynch if they didn't think he was going to help the team and that this was a legitimate signing, that Marshawn Lynch really has his heart in doing this. I'd love to see what your opinion is on Marshawn Lynch.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think he's doing this because he wants to play there. You know, this is a guy who's from the area, who I think really likes the area and likes to make a difference. So I think he does want to play there. I don't think it's a money reason that he's playing there. For me, when I heard it, it's one of those things where my reaction was literally like, meh. You know, I mean, Marshawn Lynch, this was 3 or 4 years ago. Yeah, that's a big deal. But you're talking about a guy who's already getting there on age, who's now taking a year off. And, yeah, he may be in good physical shape, but that doesn't mean you're in good football shape. And we've seen guys who even come back from injuries after a year. You're not in football shape. And that's going to take time for him to get back into. Now, could he have some games where he could be very effective? Sure. But for me, it was a move. I don't think it's a bad move, but it's not a move that makes me say now the Raiders will definitely pass New England. I think it's a fine pickup, but it doesn't really move them any further up or down than where they already were.
Well, Dan, you know what? I understand what you're saying about that, but I think it can move him down. Okay, I agree with you that it might not move him up, but I think that there's a possibility that, Marshawn Lynch has had a lot of off-field problems. And I don't know if they're called problems or he just sometimes socially he doesn't blend in very well. And we've seen some things happen where you say, boy, that's not very cool, Marshawn. And recently he was in an airport and he was getting out of there. It was a young man. Did you see that, Dan, where there was a young man trying to take a picture of him and Marshawn wasn't too happy about it? I think it was about a month ago. But I just worry about the chemistry that he's going to bring in the locker room of the Oakland Raiders. The Raiders have two really good young leaders right now in quarterback Derek Carr and defensive end Khalil Mack. Those are the leaders of the team. They're the face of the team right now. And now you're going to throw in a veteran player. And are they going to be able to control him? And I mean control him by just making sure that he doesn't do things that maybe they don't like as the leaders. And that's going to be tough. And I don't think it's going to be a problem initially. But here's what I can see happen. And believe me, Dan, as an Oakland Raider advocate, I'm hoping that I'm wrong about this. But I've seen this happen before in the NFL, where you get veterans like this that come back, and what happens is he starts out, he's doing great, but as that long season wears on, they're down in Napa, and then the season starts, and the next thing you know, he's not practicing on Wednesdays. He's not practicing on Thursdays. He's suiting up for Friday's practice and playing in the game. And then pretty soon, you know what, he's not suiting up for practices at all, but he's playing in the games. I've seen that happen before, and I think that can drag down a team's chemistry. You get in the locker room, people start saying, why does this double standard? Why is he not practicing? Why is he getting to play in the games? I'm working my butt off out there. And I just hope that doesn't happen, because he's under contract for 32 regular season games plus playoffs. The postseason games, you never know how many the Raiders are going to end up playing. Hopefully the next 2 or 3 years. He's under contract for 2 years. Hopefully there's several of them. But 32 games, Dan, I'm really interested to see how many games that Marshawn Lynch is going to play for the Oakland Raiders during the regular season. So right now the book's open. We're going to just keep our fingers crossed that this was a great signing. They did go out and get a running back late in the draft. And, again, let's talk a little bit about the Raiders draft, Dan. Again, I think they had an opportunity with their pick number 24 to get Reuben Foster. That's water under the bridge now. They did not pick Reuben Foster, but they picked a cornerback from Ohio State that right now Danny's under rape allegations. And he did take a polygraph test. He passed the test. But they took cornerback Gary Conley, 6 foot tall, 195 pounds, very fast, 4.4 40-yard dash. But again, Dan, a rape allegation. Boy, that's dangerous, Dan. Were you a little surprised about them risking their first-round pick on a person that could be out of football?
Well, two things. First off, just going back to the Lynch thing, I understood your fear of leadership, but he was never a guy who was ever known for being a troublemaker in Seattle. I mean, it was Percy Harvin was the kind of guy they got rid of. Marshawn Lynch is kind of the guy who's never really gotten in trouble. I mean, maybe he has run-ins with the media, but he's always been known as a good teammate. And frankly, I think part of this move was to help get Oakland fans back in their seats because of these couple lame duck seasons. With Conley, I mean, of course, it's surprising to have an allegation like that. That's something that's very serious. And I'm not one to jump to conclusions that he's innocent or guilty if you don't know the evidence. But Reggie McKenzie, even right after he took him, said, we did our due diligence. And I think that's what's important with this. If you're going to take a guy like this, you have to make sure that you have done all of your work, all of your research to know. And to be honest, the more and more we're hearing about it, it sounds like it may not be true, that he may not have done anything wrong. I'm not saying that he's innocent. I'm just saying some of the evidence that has come out recently, or at least, the polygraph test that wasn't even taken by the Raiders. I believe it was the Titans who said that he passed it. It's just something they have to be right about, and that's what's important there. He's a very talented player from Ohio State. They get a lot of successful NFL players. Urban Meyer knows how to get his players ready for the NFL. So if this is untrue, this rape, then that's a very talented player they've got. And I think that's the big thing they addressed in the draft was getting DBs and people on their defense. I mean, they have plenty of talent on offense. Derek Carr, they got good receivers. They have a great offensive line. And defensively, they have Bruce Irvin. They have Khalil Mack. They can get pressure on people, but their secondary was very suspect, and that's where they got burned. And I think focusing especially on DBs to start, that's what's hopefully going to make the difference so that they could beat New England in the playoffs. So we'll remain to be seen what happens with this Conley investigation. But I'm going to give Reggie McKenzie the benefit of the doubt. It seems like he's a guy who's very well respected, who's known for having a little higher character and a higher class. So if he says he did his due diligence, I'm going to give him the benefit of the doubt.
Well, I hope you're right, Dan, and I'm sure all the Oakland Raider fans here do agree with you that I think you're right, okay? They did their due diligence, and they took Gary and Conley, Dan, because he did pass a polygraph test, okay, which I think was important, Dan, okay? If he took a polygraph test and it would have came up negative, I think there was no way in the world they would have taken him. But he passed the polygraph test, so let's give him the benefit of the doubt. Innocent until proven guilty. I really agree with that. And the Raiders, for the second year in a row, did something they hadn't done since 2005. They went out and they selected defensive players in their first 3 picks. After Gary and Conley, they took a safety. I really like this safety. Obi Melifanu from Connecticut. I love his size, 6'3", 225 pounds. This guy is a freak athlete, okay? He can 40-yard dash. He ran in 4.4. Really good player that I think is definitely going to start for the Raiders next year at safety. And then they went out and they got UCLA defensive tackle Eddie Vanderdoes, 6'3", 305 pounds. Eddie had some injury problems there. Didn't really rush the quarterback all that much, Dan, but it was a good job. Did a great job against the run. And I think he'll have an opportunity to get in there and start. The Raiders did lose some players last year in the defensive line. They lost a defensive tackle, Stacy McGee. And so possibly Eddie's going to have a chance to start. Eddie's got a funny little background, though, Dan. He was very overweight there for a while, I guess, for UCLA, and he's lost 40 pounds since coming to the compound. Are you familiar with Eddie?
Yeah, I mean, a very talented player at UCLA. I mean, they had their struggles this season overall as a program, especially when Josh Rosen went down, and I think that put a strain on their offense, and since their whole team was based around him, that also impacts their defense and how many more times they're on the field and things like that. I mean, I definitely think that the Raiders went about their business and focused on, the best available players who also were fitting their needs, especially as they got later and later in the draft. I mean, like I said, this team is already a Super Bowl contender, but they have certain flaws that they need to fix, and that's where it starts, is fixing their DBs and also adding a little depth to their defense. Their offense is basically perfect where it is. They don't really need to add much more, but defensively, that's where their big flaw is, and I think that they did a good job of getting the kind of guys that they need.
Dan, you're right about their offense. Their offense is really good. They scored 30 points 8 times in 2016. That was more than the 4 seasons combined before that. The Raiders hadn't scored 30 points or more, right, Danny. So their offense is really good and it's clicking. They went out and, like I mentioned, they got some more offensive players. Sometimes, though, Dan, I wonder if it's better to get players that are been in the NFL. And like we mentioned, they got some free agent offensive players, but they didn't get any free agent defensive players. And I wondered about that and kind of wondered, why didn't you go out there and get some good established defensive players? Now, you can get them in the college draft and you can build them, and there's some pearls in there. There's no doubt about it. But, last year the Raiders allowed 16 pass plays for over 40 yards. That was the worst in the NFL. Okay, their yard per play was 6.1. That was worst in the NFL. And they only had 25 sacks last year, and you had Khalil Mack, the defensive player of the year. So they really needed to address their defense, and I'm hoping that these college players can give the Raiders a boost. But again, I question why you would not go out and get some defensive players that have been, stable players in the NFL. So we'll just hope that the Raiders these young players, and I want to just talk about the last two drafts here, Dan, for the Oakland Raiders that I thought could be legitimate players. And the Raiders really needed an inside linebacker. Their linebacker that they had last year was not very big and not very fast. Again, I was really hoping for Reuben Foster. I thought he could have come in there and been a starter right away, but they did pick up in the 5th round, their 5th pick was a linebacker, Markel Lee from Wake Forest, and he's a really fine college player. Are you familiar with Markel Lee, Dan?
Not too much. I mean, Wake Forest was kind of a surprise team this year in the ACC. You know what? When you get later and later in the draft, you're hoping to find some value there, and that's a guy who maybe could add a little value. You know, probably not going to be a superstar player, but at least maybe someone who can be an effective starter for the team. And, you know, that's what it comes down to when you get later and later in this draft. You're not necessarily looking for that A-plus player, but you're looking for that guy who's going to be useful for your team. And hopefully he can be that guy.
Yeah, well, they need it. They need an inside linebacker real bad. And, you know, he seemed like he could be a player. In the 5th round, you're getting a steal there, Dan. And I always like your philosophy about that, Dan, because sometimes you get some raw players down there that maybe with some better coaching can become better players. And Markel Lee looks like a guy that's got the right size and ability. And again, the Raiders really need to have an inside linebacker. That was one of their problems last year, was their inside linebackers were not very big and not very effective. You mentioned the outside linebackers they had. Irvin and Mack did a great job, but again, I'm hoping Markel Lee is the real deal and he can come in there. Their 4th pick was a left tackle, David Sharp from Florida. And interestingly enough, Dan, it says there was some reports that he might have had some problems. He might have some problems with his right eye, okay? He did take some tests there, but did you hear anything about that? Because I thought that was a bit peculiar.
I had not personally, but you'd be surprised some of the things guys have. I mean, you remember Jim McMahon, the quarterback? I mean, he had an accident. I think he had, I don't know if it was a fork or a knife or something that went through his eye when he was really young, and he always had bad vision out of it, and yet he still put together a pretty successful career. So you never, I mean, with those things, a lot of these guys, they become so good, it doesn't really impact them.
Yeah, Dan, that's right. And he was a Chicago Bear back in the day. That's where you were born and raised, Dan, so I'm sure you're very familiar with him. And he was a great quarterback. Boy, that was a great team, that Chicago Bears team back in the day there with Mike Singletary and the Danimal, Dan Hampton. That was a heck of a ball team, huh, Dan?
Yeah, they were pretty special. It's too bad McMahon couldn't stay healthy because they could have had a few more titles.
Yeah, well, I'll never forget the game they played the San Francisco 49ers in, and they just walloped Joe Montana, okay? Poor Joe just took a beat in that game, and the Bears went on to win the Super Bowl. But that was always an interesting tandem there with Ditka and Buddy Ryan. That was great. Yeah, that was always some good drama there, huh, Dan?
Yeah, they were definitely competitors for the same team.
Yeah. Well, Danny, listen, is there any other thoughts on the 2017 draft that you might want to add on? Because we pretty much went over our Oakland Raiders and our San Francisco 49ers, and if you didn't want to add anything, I'd like to get your thoughts on the NBA playoffs here. We're in the 2nd round now, Dan, and I know you enjoy the NBA basketball, and I do too. And is there anybody going to knock off the Golden State Warriors, Dan? And I know you're going to say Houston, right? Because Houston's looking pretty strong right now.
No, I'm definitely not going to say Houston. I'm not going to say anybody. Because I said in July it was a guarantee it would be Golden State and Cleveland in the finals, and I didn't see anybody beating Golden State. I expect that more of the same. I know Steve Kerr not being there leads to a few question marks, and we'll see how Mike Brown, if Kerr is out the rest of the playoffs, still to be determined. But I think unless Mike Brown really makes some big mistakes in some tight games, I mean, when you have 4 great players like that, I mean, Steph Curry and Kevin Durant are 2 of the top 5 players in the league. Klay Thompson is probably a top 10 player. You know, Draymond Green's probably a top 20, top 25 player. I mean, how are you going to beat that team in a 7-game series if they're healthy? And you know, Houston, they don't play that great a defense, and I don't think they're quite as good as Golden State when it comes to their shooters. I mean, yeah, James Harden can be good, but I mean, they don't really have a Klay Thompson to Steph Curry. That's kind of one of their issues, or a Kevin Durant, who you sometimes forget. It's like, man, they have that many great shooters. So I don't expect Houston. I want to see what happens with Houston and San Antonio, because I still think San Antonio could give them a run just because of Kawhi Leonard, how well they defend. Greg Popovich is the best coach in the league. They could maybe give them a run, and we already know what Cleveland can do. But if Golden State stays healthy, I just can't see them losing.
I agree with you about Golden State staying healthy and they're not going to lose. But I did see something the other night when I watched Houston and San Antonio, and one game does not make a series. But I really thought that Houston is rolling right now. They're rolling on all cylinders. I don't think San Antonio is going to be able to slow them down. They don't play defense like you mentioned, Dan, but they shoot so many three-pointers, and they're very accurate when they could give the Warriors a great 7-game series. And I really want to see Houston Rockets and Golden State Warriors in a 7-game series. I think that could go 7 games. I think the Warriors will win in 7, but I think the Rockets are definitely peaking at the right time. And I'm playing devil's advocate here a little bit, because I liked San Antonio in the beginning of the season, but I don't see them peaking right now. I think they struggled against the Memphis Grizzlies, and after the first game, and I know they're playing again tonight here, Dan, I know after the first game they took a really bad beating there, and we've seen this happen throughout the NBA all the time, that once a team gets beaten like that, they really suck it up the next game, and I wouldn't be surprised to see San Antonio come back and play much better in this game, going to Houston for the next 2 games. But I really think the Houston Rockets and the Golden State Warriors, that's what the NBA needs, and that's what they want to see. In the Eastern Conference, Boston is starting to peak at the right time right now, Dan. They lost those first 2 games to the Chicago Bulls, and since then they ran off 5 straight victories. Or 6, excuse me. They beat Washington yesterday in an overtime game that was really exciting. 53 points out of Isaiah Thomas. They're peaking at the right time, and I think it's going to come down to be Cleveland and Boston in that Eastern Conference, and I like the Warriors in Houston, and I think those are going to be both very competitive championship series. Again, Dan, I'm going to go with you. I think the Warriors are going to win the Western Conference. I think Cleveland will win the Eastern Conference. And then it's going to be just a fantastic NBA championship. We're going to see a repeat now of Cleveland and the Golden State Warriors. And last year, the Warriors were up 3-1, Dan, and let that get away. You know that they're just can't wait to get back there with Kevin Durant and take on LeBron James and the Cleveland Cavaliers. And Dan, I'm going to ask you this question before I let you go. And I appreciate you staying on so long here on my podcast today, Dan. And
no problem.
I'm going to ask you this, though, before we leave, because there's been a lot of talk about the MVP in the NBA. And obviously the number 1 candidate is Russell Westbrook. Number 2 candidate is James Harden. Number 3 candidate, LeBron James. Number 4 candidate, Kyrie Leonard from San Antonio.
Leonard?
Yes, Leonard there from San Antonio, excuse me. And then maybe Steph Curry at number 5. I don't understand why people don't see the value in LeBron James. To me, there's no player that does as much for his team than LeBron James. What's your thoughts on who do you like for that MVP?
Well, I see what you mean. In the end, it's kind of like the Michael Jordan rule. I mean, LeBron James, you could give it to every year. He's the best two-way player. But I would say if you look at this year, there's nobody who's been more valuable than Russell Westbrook. I mean, that guy not only averaged a triple-double and broke the record for triple-doubles in a season, his team won 80% of their games when he had a triple-double, at least during the regular season. It may have changed a bit in the playoffs. And then they won about 20% when he did. I mean, if you watch that series, you brought the point up about Houston. I actually think Houston just played one really good game. They really didn't look that great against OKC. It's just that outside of Westbrook, OKC is nobody else, and that's why they ended up beating them. I mean, Russell Westbrook did about as good as he did with one of the worst teams in the NBA. I mean, if he's not on that team, they'd have the worst record in the league. they're that kind of team.
Oh, Dan,
So
you
for
know
me,
what? I got to
it's
disagree.
Definitely him.
Yeah, I got to disagree with you on that, Dan. I don't know if you know this, but Russell Westbrook had the 7th best shooting percentage on his team. There were 6 other players on his team that when they shot the ball, they made it more often than Russell Westbrook. Now, he took so
How
many
many times did they shoot it, Nick? That's kind of the thing. I mean, if you're going to include some big men, I mean, Russell Westbrook, I mean, if you also look at it, he led the league in scoring, and if you look at also the way they played in that series against Houston, there's nobody on that team who would scare anyone. And, you know, those guys, maybe they had a better shooting percentage, yet they were nowhere to be found in the playoffs.
Well, that point is well taken, but I'll tell you this, Dan. They don't get to shoot because he doesn't pass. I just don't.
Well, if he has 10 assists, I don't think it's fair to say he doesn't pass.
Well,
you can't be. You know, I see what you're saying, Nick. In the end, he did shoot a lot. And
he
that's
shot
a fair
more.
criticism.
He
but
shot
I would say he has to shoot because that's how. But you have to look at his team, and I don't think his team. I mean, is there anyone else in that team who you think is an all-star caliber player or somebody who you would want to take over a game who could really shoot consistently?
Well, I don't think there's an all-star caliber player on the team, no. But I do think that Russell Westbrook, when he came out, a couple of things that he said this year that really turned me off, Dan, and I'll just leave it with this, okay? And your points are well taken, Dan, and I believe this. I'm going to tell you this. You're right. Russell Westbrook is going to get the MVP of the NBA. I believe that 100%, and I think you're spot on. But I disagree with it. And my last couple of things I'm going to say about it is this. When he came out and told people early in the season that he doesn't watch film, I thought to myself, okay, that is just wrong right there. You don't watch film of the teams you're going to play, of yourself, of your other team, things that can make you better. You know as well as I do, preparation is so important in anything you're going to do. And when he came out and says, no, you know what? I don't prepare by watching film. I guarantee you there's almost every player in the NBA that plays a lot watches film. Would you agree with that?
Well, yeah, to be fair, Nick, are you referring to the time when they asked him if he had watched like a Warriors game the night before and he said he doesn't watch games like that? Because I don't know if he doesn't necessarily watch tape. I think he may have just meant he doesn't watch games on his spare time, but he may still, when the team watches film, I'm sure he still watches film.
Well, I don't know, Dan. It did change. It did change later in the season. He did mention that, hey, you know what? I did see some things. I watched some film. So maybe it did change. I don't think what you're talking about was specifically what I had heard. I had heard that he didn't need to watch film. He played the game. He knows the game. He didn't need to watch film of anybody that he's going to compete against or anything that he did. But that did change throughout the season. There was a point in time I did hear him come out and say, you know what, I watched a little film. But secondly, Dan, when he said this, I thought, okay, this is like the worst. When he said that his dad had taught him when he was a young boy that his best friend on the basketball court was Spalding or Wilson, was the basketball.
Right.
That was just wrong. That was wrong right there. And once he tried to come back and make it up and say, you know what? No, my teammates. No, he said the truth. He's a ball hog. He wants Spalding in his hands. He wants Wilson in his hands or whatever, the Rock, whatever you want to call it. That was just wrong right there. And I don't think a guy that's the most valuable player in the league, it can't be all about him. He has to be a team player. And that's why I like James Harden more than what he's done for the Houston Rockets over Westbrook. And I'd also like to put LeBron James would be number one for me. But again, he's not going to.
Can I put
Absolutely.
that comment he made in context?
Yes.
The question they asked him was because he and James Harden are known to be friends, and they asked him about is it awkward, playing with your friend, and that's why he said, well, my only friend is the basketball. I don't think he meant it as. There wasn't a question of if he trusted his teammates. It was more, is it weird playing with your friends? And he's saying, I don't have friends on the court, as in, when I'm on the court, who we are off the court doesn't really matter. I'm worried about winning the game.
Well, Dan, that makes a whole lot of difference then. If that's what the context was, because I didn't hear that first part of the question. I just heard his answer, and the answers came about the basketball, Dan. So, you know what? If you said that there was more to that question and that the media only showed the last part of his answer, then that absolutely makes a big difference to me, Dan. Okay, but I did see him come back on the air a few days later and address it because people had come to him and said, wait a minute, your best friend on the court is a basketball? Your teammates?
Well, and Nick, this happened when he was asked. Sorry, he wasn't asked. This was during their series against Houston, and they were asking one of his teammates about what changes, why they struggle so much when Westbrook is off the court. He actually interrupted the reporter and said, "Don't try to tear us apart. We're one team." And it actually kind of got airways where he wasn't letting the reporter answer his question. So I think, if anything, he does try to defend his teammates. He has never thrown them under the bus for as bad a team as they are.
All right, Dan. Well, you know what,
him,
Dan, you were spot on a lot of stuff, and I love talking to Danny Reiter from the mighty 1090 down there, the sports leader in San Diego. Hopefully, Dan, you're going to get your college game day back on next year because I really enjoyed that show. How's that looking, Dan? Are you going to be back on the air? They've been talking about it.
It's so early, Nick. I don't even think they're worried about that right now.
Well, I am, Dan. So anyway, listen, thank you so much for joining us today here in the Lethal Weapon 2 studio with my producer, David Perkins. I want to thank our listeners for joining in here on the 10th inning, and we're going to be back in a couple of weeks. So stay tuned for the 10th inning with Nick Mattos, David Perkins in the Lethal Weapon 2 studio, and Danny Reiter. You can follow Danny on Twitter at SportsWriter12. Is that right, Dan?
Yep, you got it. Reiter is how you spell Reiter.
All right, Dan. Thanks again for joining me today, Dan. Really appreciate it. And all your insights well taken. This is the 10th inning.
Nick, anytime.
This is the 10th inning with Nick Mattos.